Morning, everybody. So we're doing a little Q&A today. It'll be pretty informal. I'm with Mike Boone and Liam Kelly. Morning, guys.
Morning, mate. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Looking
Good.
forward to the weekend. It's a beautiful. Went up for a walk at Mount Eden this morning, and God, it was beautiful.
Yeah, no, it's really tended on.
Yeah. Welcome to the Facebook and also YouTube viewers. We've got our YouTube channel. It hasn't had a lot of love yet, but we thought we'd get it out there, and it's actually quite good for people like my old man Alan, who apparently is dialing in. If he can get his 2007 Acer MacBook Pro or whatever he's got going, he'll be fiddling away with it right now. But morning, Alan, in the middle of
You'll probably tune in 5 minutes to go, but nonetheless, it's the thought that
fast out,
counts.
and then he'll just leave and say, "Oh yeah, I caught the end of your chat." So today we're keeping this, like I said, pretty informal. We'll start off before the questions come in. We'll start off with just a few little legal tidbits. Liam, there was a case in the Supreme Court, I understand, last week, a decision, Bathurst and L&M Coal Holdings. It was a decision about the paramountcy, is that the right word? I think so.
Primacy
of contractual terms over pre or post contractual negotiations. And I'll just hand it over to Liam in a second, but I'll just, for those who don't want to labour through the really difficult minutiae of such a decision, we can put the link in afterwards. Essentially, Liam, am I right that the court said that, the terms of the contract are paramount, and that while evidence can be admissible around the negotiations, therefore it is definitely worthwhile as a negotiating party to go back and forth and clarify, so you have as much evidence as possible as to what the parties intended and the agreed meaning. That's still not, that shouldn't be taken out of context, and the words ultimately are everything. So just want to give it a bit of a...
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good précis of it all, really. I mean, again, as you said, it's a pretty complex area, and I mean, the House of Lords have themselves gone back and forth on the point, so it's definitely not a clean-cut area. But yeah, so the most important thing that has come from this decision is basically the courts just reaffirming that the words are everything, and that the pre-contractual negotiations and whatnot, subsequent conduct, although they can sometimes inform what the parties really truly mean in a dispute about a word in the contract, it's still not as good to rely on those than to simply just have a very well negotiated, clear-cut agreement, because the courts, it can go either way sometimes, whether it's admissible, those pieces of evidence, to sort of corroborate your party's view of that interpretation. So it's definitely, it's a fallback position. You definitely don't want to rely on it. It's basically the very cut and short and dry part of it.
Yeah. So
they don't, because courts don't really like, or at least have very little enthusiasm for sort of saying, well, this is a bit debatable, but if we look at the evidence, you almost start to try form like a secondary agreement, and they don't really like that.
Yeah, no, they don't. Yeah, that's what and one of the, while this party got there in the end, and enforced one of those $60 million payments, and they had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get it, and I'm sure they spent hundreds of thousands and use of money at the time. It's just not worth it. So get those contractual terms drafted by a lawyer who specializes in contractual negotiations and contract drafting, and make sure if the deal is if the downside is significant from not being able to prove clearly that there's an agreement on certain terms, you need to get someone that knows what they're doing to put it together to safeguard you. It'll be the best money you ever spend in business.
It's just tying up all those loose ends,
tying up all the loose ends and doing everything. I mean, there's no way to cover off every single little risk on a subject, but ultimately, end of the day, if the judge is looking at it and saying, oh, that's the other thing. The last thing I'd say is they said that, the negotiations are really effective. You may have covered this, Liam, but I'll just reiterate it. The negotiations as evidence are admissible to the extent that they will demonstrate, if they can show what a reasonable person with all of the knowledge and background of the parties that
Yes.
what those people would have actually done in that situation.
Mm.
And so while the contract is paramount, that will help. So it definitely helps to work around the problem
Yeah.
in that way.
And it's still, though, that's still just the tool, you know. It's sort of determining what a reasonable person. So even then, it's still not definitively coming down on either way to sort of say this is the interpretation.
We'll give you a good example, guys, of viewers out there. After, obviously, there's all this talk about clause 27.5 of the ADA's lease. And then there was always talk about what a reasonable percentage was. And Michael Moen wrote a great article in the NBR about that approximately a year ago. What we've done since then, though, is when we're negotiating leases for our clients, we want to see a clause in there that says that the parties having regard to clause 27.5 agree that, for example, 30% is reasonable. They've had negotiations, turn their mind to it, and that will be the discount of rent going forward in the event of more lockdowns. Crystal clear, no argument. Everyone has had that negotiation at the time that the lease was entered into. Of course, holders of older parties to older leases don't have that luxury, but definitely the best that's a crystal clear example of clarifying the contractual position at the time in light of the circumstances that you're dealing with. Mike, do you want to speak at all about that last comment?
I just had one thing to maybe chew on a little bit, which was so this idea that things outside of the contract are not going to be particularly pertinent to interpreting it. Or at least the door's still open. You can still get it through the Evidence Act, but the court's not going to put a lot of weight on it. So there's still this distinction, right, that it's an objective exercise. So obviously any internal comms you have that go towards what you think something in a contract means are likely, particularly after this judgment, to be completely irrelevant. But there's still some scope for things that you've communicated to the other side. So, for example, if you send some sort of correspondence around the formation of the contract saying, we think that this term means X, we think in this scenario, this is how it will play out, that's still potentially relevant when it comes to interpreting what it means. I just think that's interesting because obviously sometimes you're looking to try and create as much certainty as you can in a contract, but other times it's kind of a useful strategy to fudge it a bit. And you may want to get things through that the other side might not be prepared to agree to if it's all set out explicitly.
What we always say to our clients in that situation is if they say, say that the lawyers drafted a party, the other party's drafted a contract, and the other party's lawyer has drafted a contract. God, having a mayor there, and they bring it to you. Your client brings it to you, and they say, "What do you think of all this?" And you say, "Well, it's mostly pretty good, but there is this clause here that's not really very accurate, and it's not really from what your instructions to us are what was agreed." So you've got two choices. One, you let it go in the hope that that uncertainty may favor you in the future if that party is trying to enforce that contract. That could be a good strategy. However, if it is something which is kind of a coin flip as to which way it would go, and there isn't certainty, and you need to rely on it, it's an ill-advised move to leave it as it is. So my usual approach towards that is only in the most obvious of cases where you're 95 or 99% certain that you don't want the other party to be able to enforce that obligation, that you would let that go. It can end up, you think you're clever, but you're actually just causing more pain in the long run. You've got a question, James Ashman. What are your rights with a sublease? If the party who holds the head lease is receiving a discount from the landlord, are you entitled to the same percentage they are receiving? I'm going to put that to the board.
I think it would depend entirely on the agreement you have with the leasee. Like, there's no sort of statutory framework or anything informing that, so it would just be a question of what that agreement says.
Yep. So the party who holds the head lease has worked. Johnny on the spot here. The party who holds the head lease is receiving a discount. So if the tenant is getting a loan, are they obligated to put it in another way to pass
pass that on?
Well, usually subleases have terms that say everything, that the lessee the sublessee, sorry, has to comply with all the terms under the head lease. Oftentimes that there'll be a provision saying except for all payment obligations. I've seen that quite a lot. And I would think that it would be unlikely unless a sublessee in a very powerful position, which is it's a bit of an oxymoron in and of itself, would actually have that clause in there that said that. I don't imagine that it would turn on, and it's quite fitting really from all the things the first topic we just talked about. It's going to turn on wording of the contract. Put it this way, it'd be very unusual for a sub-landlord to draft a sublease in a way that if they received benefit separately from the head lease under their contract, which is their head lease or their deed,
and then to not pass it on.
To put something in there that says that they're obligated to pass any of that benefit on to the sublessee. Highly unlikely, to answer that question. And another one, Cameron Proctor, Kakapo, business sales. For a health and fitness business suffering from the total effect of all these lockdowns, and they use it as a reason to get out of their lease. That's a challenging question and an interesting question. I've been toying with that a bit lately. Mike and Liam, do you want to just talk a little bit to Cameron to actually answer that question? You need to break down a couple of things. First of all, a little bit of a discussion about what the doctrine of frustration is. Anyone want to have a go at taking that on?
Mike do. I'll let Mike do it. I feel like that's much more his sort of forte, the arcane debates for and against.
Well, I mean, the doctrine of frustration is effectively that if some sort of supervening thing beyond either party's anticipation or control means that you can't perform your half of a contract, then that can be a ground for cancelling it. It's the whole act of God thing. But it's a reasonably narrow doctrine. I'm not aware of anyone successfully employing it in the case of COVID. I don't think that it's very likely to fly, given that you've got a provision in the majority of leases, at any rate, all of the ADLS ones, that deal with this situation. And reverting back to the topic we opened with, the fact that the contract has clauses in place that anticipate no access and that stipulate what has to happen in that scenario, and what happens is not that one party can cancel and walk away, at least until that period. I forget what the default is. I think maybe 6 months, yes. And then there's an out. I think that process would have to be followed, and where there's nothing governing that, you might be able to run that kind of argument. But
let's just
I guess there's also I wonder also the utility to actually run that argument I would say the person who tries to argue that would be in a different position if they were entering into this contract before COVID happened, or if they were trying to enter into this contract while everyone knows what COVID is. It would seem a bit more, it'd be much more surprising to see them succeed to say, by a doctrine of frustration argument, entering into it now than had they done in 2018 when COVID was basically non-existent.
Because any judge in a court of law is going to say, if you were properly advised, and like we talked about, you would have turned your mind to this. You say you took a huge health and fitness, like a massive gym lease somewhere, and it was hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and whoever's advising you, you've got to think that they would walk you through the possibility that there could be continued extended lockdowns, multiple continued extended, and the effect that would have on your business, and you went into that with your eyes wide open. Like
I think
yeah, fantastic point. 5 years ago.
And
there you go. Yep.
Sorry, no.
Yeah, there you go.
Look, and I think there's just, again, if it was in this day and age, I think there'd be just a bit more ammunition probably to shoot down that kind of argument. Because it is narrow, like Mike said, but then because it really has to be the whole totality of the contract has to be rendered basically futile. I think it'd be easier to really pot holes in it by sort of saying, well, you can actually do online classes for your gym, or it's actually just for the lockdown, and then everything substantially just goes back to being the same. It's not sort of like the whole nature of this agreement is all of a sudden it's just impossible. I think from just, at least there's an argument to be made which would make it not a slam dunk. So you'd have to be pretty brave, I think.
I tell you what, though, if it was like a Les Mills or something like that, say lo and behold we had 6 more 2-month lockdowns in the next 2 years. So it was just crazy. There's more strands of this thing coming out, and and then they got hold of a real gun QC like a Mark O'Brien or someone like that, and they ran an argument that for example, 12 out of the last 18 or 22 months, this business couldn't operate. It's a bums on seats gym membership. Everyone now, at first they stayed around and they put their memberships on hold. We've now lost 78% of our bums on seats. This lease, which is the whole purpose is for people to come in and actually use the gym, the whole purpose is rendered redundant, which means that the contract is frustrated. So it's not as open and close as I think as you might think. No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just devil's advocate. I've agreed with everything you guys have said. I'm just saying that if it went on and on and on, it's a question of extent. And
the period very relevant, right? Yeah, like if you're talking like almost the entire benefit of the lease is gone, well, that's one thing. But if you're talking 3 or 4 weeks where you can't access your premises, but you're still using them to store your possessions, and you're going to start business there again when things tick back up, and that's within the context of a 5-year lease, to say that contract has been entirely frustrated is just not going to fly. So
I guess again, just to put another through line in, I guess from what we were saying, is to make sure that to have it in your agreements or whatnot, saying again, if for some reason that because of COVID, you might want to get quite specific, we have agreed that if we can't access or do the benefit of the lease for agreement for however many months, we have the right to cancel it. Which wouldn't technically be the doctrine of frustration, but the net effect is broadly similar in the sense that basically the parties are saying, look, this isn't working out, and
just because obviously a lot of commentators, including ourselves, have laboured this whole point to death. So just going to sort of switch the topic a little bit. The housing market. Mike, Liam, and I just went trawled through the internet and found a whole. We can link them up afterwards in the comment sections on both YouTube and Facebook about the housing market, what's happening, what has happened, what's going to happen. I'll just make a couple of quick comments because it's not massively my area. It's more Mike's area. But it's interesting that we had I'll just sort of make a bunch of bullet points about it, Mike, and then I'll just let you do your thing. So obviously the OCR, there was a lot of commentary that it was going to be increased, and then lo and behold, the day after the announcement of level 4, they didn't increase it. So maybe that was artificial. Maybe it would have been. I'll get you to talk a little bit about the effect of that. There's some of the articles that we talked about this morning, guys. There was talk about the 25 to 30% increase in the market a year ago after lockdown. Some commentators say that there's not that give in the market now because we're already so much more. The prices have increased so much that affordability is down. And so does it mean like now could it go again? Arguably not, but I'm interested to hear what you've got to say about that. Also, I saw a stat that 23, there were a year ago, there were 23 locations around New Zealand, I'm assuming cities, that had a gross yield of rental for residential investment properties of 5% or greater, is now down to 14 as we sit here today. And there was also some talk about the increasing gap between prices and the rent staying the same, partly off the back of the freezes last year, which altogether are making residential investment property arguably less attractive. And the last thing I'll say is, despite all of that, historically over time, because the fact that the major banks bankroll that investment and we're a stakeholder society and everyone always needs places to live and the supply is limited, in the macro, there's a good argument you can't really go wrong with property investment, and it's much less fraught with technicality or than a lot
Right.
of more technical products that there is a real, there can be a lot of difficulty understanding what's going on with.
I guess the first thing I would say is that,
Sorry,
know-
who's got that in the background?
not me.
What's this?
There's a whole lot of background noise.
I'm sorry.
That's right. All good?
It bears remembering that a year ago, when the first lockdown occurred and there was all that quantitative easing, it was very hard to find any economic commentators who said that house prices would go up. So what happened really defied all the predictions and sort of speaks to how difficult it is to try and make any prognostications in this area. There was a very good article by the governor of the Reserve Bank on NBR maybe 2 weeks ago, and it was one of the better ones I've seen on this topic because it actually made mention of a lot of concrete facts, and I think it made a persuasive argument. It certainly persuaded me that the position this time round is very different to last time round. The main reason for that is this whole problem with housing in New Zealand has been supply side driven. So there's simply been, there's just not enough houses for people, and that's the basic reason that there's all this sort of price hysteria over it. That is soon going to not be the case. The rate of building and the decrease in immigration and all of that, when you put it all together, it looks like within a year to 2 years, there's going to be vastly more housing than there's a real need for it. So I think that is quite likely on its own to drive prices down, or at the very least stabilize them. But then you add to that the fact it doesn't look like we're in for another massive round of QE. It looks like interest rates are still likely to go back up a little bit over the next 6 to 12 months. That'll have an effect too. One thing I thought was interesting is I forget exactly what the data was that he pointed to, but it was quite credible. This idea that all of the sort of price rise recently has been fueled by investment. Well, actually, most investor money has sort of moved away from the residential housing sector some time ago for obvious reasons. I mean, people look at it and they say the annual return we're getting is terrible. Relying on capital gains at this point is risky, given how hot it is, and given the government's, got a real focus now on regulatory intervention, which, whether it works or not, is going to potentially make your life unpleasant if you own rental properties. So that money's moved on largely, and a lot of the recent growth or the recent demand is driven by first home buyers. So I would, if I had to make a prediction, and I mean this is something that everyone's predictions have failed, but I'd say that idea that within a year to 2 years we could see a drop in house prices, I think that's probably true, and certainly, particularly in certain areas, like the apartment market, for example, I think could be in for a bit of a tumble. There's just been so much development of townhouses and apartments, and there's less value in the underlying land there to sort of hold things up. So yeah, that's sort of my ballpark on it.
Well, that's somewhat relieving to hear for me. I somewhat will be able to buy a house.
Got a couple more questions. Has the Brightline, and Mike, we're going to go to you again here. Has the new Brightline test affected the market?
The honest answer is I don't know. I'd be surprised if it's had an enormous effect, but I can say that people that I deal with who are in the business of investing in that asset class, it's certainly something that has become a consideration. It's certainly affecting people's purchasing decisions. Like there was a thing I dealt with recently where there was a lot of talk about it was a trust buying an asset for a beneficiary who, had kind of quite indeterminate ideas about what they would do with themselves over the long term. And so there was a lot of talk about whether, if they moved on, whether the trust would buy it, you'd have. Sorry, I'm getting a bit beyond what's necessary here. The underlying point is just that it's affecting people's decision making to some extent.
Okay, I think you keep going with where you're going with that. It's interesting.
No, there was not a lot more to say, really. It was a technical withdrawal.
I'm out.
Declare victory and walk off the field. I like it.
I like it. Just something, an interesting anecdotal observation from our practice is that it's not affecting people. I've got a couple of property investors, a guy called Crone that we act for, that's buying up property left, right, and centre with flagrant disregard for any kind of technical advice that we give him. But that's Crone. But I mean, the interesting thing is that it's an alias, by the way. Anyone out there who thinks we're so unprofessional as to breach, know they know I'm talking about. But just back to the more serious subject, I don't think that it's affecting purchasers' decisions to still acquire property, particularly those with a macro or long-term view of the asset class, which I said, as we said, is proven over time. But I think it is affecting our clients' decision as to whether or not to dispose of property, to sell it. We're getting asked it a lot. We always try and do the old sideways shuffle and give it to the accountant because it's not risk that we want out on our books, even though intuitively we usually know whether or not it'll be tainted. That is definitely it. So that we're not economists, and Mike, you might want to speak a little bit about whether or not or what the long-term effect of that may be, that these investors that held this property that were flicking them and making money at certain points along the way of the life cycle of the asset, which is of course eternal. The fact that what is the effect of those people not actually disposing of that property?
Well, it'll be a drop in the supply coming onto the market, and to the extent that will happen, it will have happened by now. So that will have been an effect that's been felt from the moment that bright line test came in. I don't know whether that did cause a drop in supply, but there'd be data on that. You'd be able to see whether the number of properties listed before and after, whether there was a significant drop. Yes. But whether or not there has been, that's baked in now. So when you look at the Reserve Bank's projections about the supply side of the equation and how that's going to change over the next sort of 2-year period, that won't be, those projections will account for that.
Yep. Got another question. If I subdivided a property I purchased within the last 12 months, would I be subject to the new property for the bright line test? Well, I actually don't know the answer as to whether or not a subdivision is an acquisition under the legislation. I don't know the bright line test that acutely to give that person an answer to that question. What I would say though is it makes practical little difference anyway, because if you only acquired in the last 12 months, it means your period, even if it does apply, it means your non-sell period's gone from 10 to 11 years or 11 to 10 years as the case may be. So it's practically of no difference to you. What would be a more interesting question is if you subdivided a property that was purchased, say, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, would that then trigger the bright line test? We have to get someone who are more specialists than us, a lot of mugs, general practitioners, to actually give advice. It's the first thing we would do. We say, is this going to... Well, intuitively, no, because it would still be property that you had acquired. Yeah, Liam?
Yeah, no, I don't think... Yeah, intuitively, and I don't believe it does apply to subdivisions. I think there's an exception. I think it depends, especially if you're living on it as well. I think there's like a ratio. If you're still 50%, if your main home still forms like 50% of the land you're subdividing, I think they can still consider it a main home, and I think there's a exemption there. But unfortunately, I can't provide you any more clarity on that. But
And also the other challenge around that would be there's no, on paper anyway, no actual value attributed to changing hands in terms of the purchase price or acquisition cost associated with that, because it's not actually a disposal of land. But again, we're over our heads on that one. Sometimes it's best to just phone a friend. Yeah, phone a friend. I'll call Michael. All right. Okay. Just again, so that's probably enough on that one. But another question from the Fixed Space page. What impact do you think the rise in non-traditional currencies will have on the traditional lending institutions and ultimately buyers and investors, i.e. crypto? Let's just read it again. What impact do you think the rise in non-traditional currencies will have on the traditional lending institutions? So the impact that crypto will have on the banks and ultimately on us. Anyone?
I mean, no, you go, Mike.
I was just going to say, I think ultimately an enormous impact, but not until the institutional investors adopt it. So eventually these distributed ledger models are going to become ubiquitous and they're going to become mainstream. And obviously at that point, they'll just be a part of daily life. I don't know if the kind of activity that's going on now will have a huge impact on anything.
I don't know. I'm personally still a little bit on the fence about it, really. I mean, only because I agree eventually it will become much more prevalent than it does now. But whether it's just sort of wholesale adopted is just the way of doing things. Because I find just nowadays, I mean, originally the whole sort of crypto movement was to really have just peer-to-peer interaction. So there's, no fees to basically for me to pay you money. But it sort of seems as we're getting along the track, all of a sudden all these intermediaries are basically creating their own sort of version of like a crypto version of what a bank is, really. I mean, sometimes, especially all these exchanges and stuff, that you're still paying 1% or something of whatever that cryptocurrency you're holding, just to affect it or just to sell. And it kind of seems to be sort of supplanting just the traditional currency formula into just a very digital online crypto formula. It's in my mind, that's sort of how I'm seeing it. Now, I might not be right, but I think just in my head, that sort of seems the way it's going. So intuitively, I'm just not sure whether it will sort of just become the way, or maybe in fact, maybe I have sort of convinced myself, maybe that would be just the way of doing things, because that's basically how it's done anyway. It's just, instead of A, it's B.
I read a great opinion piece probably 9 months ago saying that the cryptos that most mimic the characteristics of the institutions will actually end up being the most likely to succeed anyway.
Yeah. There are some areas of efficiency to capture too, like the torrent system for land transfer could be very disrupted by a ledger-based version. There are already people with designs to do that here. It's happening in Scandinavia. That kind of thing could make those transactions a lot more cost efficient. And obviously there are big advantages for flows of money between people around the world, like crypto's got a lot of value if you live in a country where there's a lot of corruption. It's a way to get money in and out without it going through the hands of a bunch of bureaucratic intermediaries.
Yes.
Who probably corrupt themselves.
So that could bring a lot of people in parts of the world that are kind of financially isolated back into the fold. That could have some effect, but I think it's pretty hard to know.
I still just struggle to grapple with, because I mean the whole point was sort of decentralizing it. But then I mean, just if all of a sudden banks are involved, I mean then you're basically bringing back into the fold the very thing that you're trying to circumvent. So it's a bit of a head scratcher for me, really.
Just on a slight derivation of topic, but the same subject broadly. I think that and I know very little about this, and I'm a very tepid, uninformed crypto investor who's really in their FOMO and nothing else, as Liam well knows. But from what I have read and what I do understand, which is limited in both instances, particularly the latter, is that anything tied to the blockchain and the development of the blockchain is a different beast altogether, and that could have significant implications for the way society functions going forward. That is probably the utilitarian points in its favor than just actually currencies not tethered to a much broader operating sphere, if that's the right word for it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the technology of blockchain technology is probably going to be a much more ubiquitous, fundamental sort of like development to everyone than just simply just the tracking currency. Yeah.
And that's what's always completely baffled me, and that's why I never got on it any earlier. Now with the Ethereum, which I like because of that blockchain component, but the whole Bitcoin argument, and to me, it's just this thing. There's a store of value.
Well, I mean, it's
do anything.
It's just subject to the whims of the day, really. It's just and I mean, much like many things are, it's just that one just seems to be particularly,
I haven't looked at trying to invest in crypto for 2 or 3 years, but when I did, at the time, you needed to buy.
You go around with the hat and get like a series of close confidants of yours involved.
I did. I managed to invest in cryptocurrency with other people's money, which is always a good way.
It always seems to be the best way to do it.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed at the time, and Shane, you've been doing this more recently, so you might be able to confirm whether this has changed. When I did it, you needed to buy Bitcoin to buy basically anything else. You had to get your Bitcoin, sign up with an exchange, get your Bitcoin onto the exchange, and then you could buy a whole raft of stupid things that you could subsequently lose money on. But
you will.
To me, that seemed to be the thing that was holding up the value in Bitcoin, because a lot of these derivative blockchain assets sort of have these use cases where you can read about what they're designed to do, and you can say, well, I could see that might have a business case, but you need to buy them. It's kind of like, it's like the greenback of that sort of economy. You need it to buy these other things. And I would have thought if that changed and you could effortlessly, play in that market straight from your own currency or from some other thing like Ethereum, then that might make Bitcoin kind of a bit of a question mark in terms of whether it's going to remain tenable. Like when you recently bought stuff, Shane, what was the kind of process? Did you buy straight Ethereum?
It's simple. You just can buy it from Easy Crypto, and while the fees are about higher for New Zealand because it's New Zealand exchange, I just wanted the safety of dealing with someone, from New Zealand.
Pick up a phone and talk to if you needed to.
I looked into it a little bit, and it's all quite scary. Sending money and getting these arrays of letters and numbers, and then trying to like copy and paste them, and wondering where the hell this thing that doesn't exist has actually gone to. But yeah, the latest one I bought, which is definitely more speculative, was I had to transfer some of my Ethereum. You could do Bitcoin or Ethereum. I don't have any Bitcoin from a little, key ledger wallet, cold wallet onto my computer, and then from there onto, from the ledger which you plug into the computer, and then into this other exchange, and then you had to exchange that Ethereum for this other token that I've got. So you're right, it was necessary. Although I hear a lot of these smaller coins are in the process of trying to cut that middleman out. So remains to be seen. Let's just quickly move on to next question. Cameron Proctor of Kakapo: will increased interest rates increase supply in the property market by affecting affordability for those that are either highly leveraged or have recently purchased and therefore forced to sell? Will increased interest rates increase supply in the property market by affecting well, yes. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. If you just think about it, if you think about, say, a typical upper middle class family that has a family home in Onehunga, they bought it in 2006 for $450,000. No offense to anyone from Onehunga if they're watching, it was a lot more than that, and it's currently worth 1.2, and their mortgage is 100,000. They go and buy a rental property for 800,000 in a sort of fast fast-moving suburb, and they even if they are quite conservative, actually that's probably not a good example. Say someone that bought it in 2014 and they've got 400k, or so say 200k of usable equity, they go buy the rental property, and interest rates go from 2 to historical average of 7.2% in the next 2 or 3 years. If then your wife goes and has another child, or she loses her job, or your income goes from 180k to 100k because you lose a good job and you get a worse one and she's not working, all of that, the cumulative effect on all of that, and if you have some other financial stress in that time, the cumulative effect of all of that, all of a sudden you may be forced to tip in money into that investment property. And there are people that are doing it with, say, over and over and over again, who have perhaps made a bit more money, have a bit more equity, doing it over and over again. And there is, I'm not being doomsday about it, but that is a highly possible outcome. Mike?
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, it'll be weather the storm, but there'll be a margin of people who are distressed for either because of other financial pressures, like Shane mentioned, and there'll also be the subset of people who really leverage themselves to the hilt. I mean, there are people out there that have dozens of properties and an enormous debt to equity ratio, and the whole thing's very finely tuned, and it's all really relying on the prices going up and up. And
one of our clients is buying up property out of control at the moment using bank funding, but it's actually quite clever because this guy earns really well, and if he continues to earn really well, his worst case scenario is he's having to tip some of that hard earned in, but because he's spreading all the assets all over the place, theoretically speaking, even if he has a few duds and he's forced to sell, that's actually not the end of the world. As long as you have enough income coming in to actually pay the mortgage down, that's why the bank's always looking at serviceability as an absolutely critical component to lend these days. Because worst case scenario, even at 6% or 7% in terms of, I can't remember the term that one of our friends at BNZ just used recently, not stress test, but I can't remember exactly what it was. But those people are still fine if they've got a really long view of how it all plays out, i.e. you keep funding it for a while. It's not the end of the world.
But there will be a subset of those people that have to sell down some assets.
Yeah, that don't have that income stream that can plug the gap. It's a bit like and I don't mean to be crude, but it's a bit like people that wet themselves playing the pokies because they know that if they stay on the Ferris wheel long enough, they will win in the end and get that jackpot, so they don't want to go to the bathroom. It's a bit like that. You need to stay on the Ferris wheel, and if you've got other sources of income to plug the gap, you eventually will win out. But if you don't, then in the short run, you may be forced to go to the bathroom, and when you go to the bathroom, you're going to get dressed down. I think we might have missed one. Here we go, Sterling Arnett. Do you think people will look at business investment over property due to the bright line? They already are doing that. Absolutely.
Well, business investment, certainly. Commercial assets as opposed to residential assets, that's somewhat curtailed by the banks being very unhappy to lend for commercial assets at the moment.
You mean commercial property?
Yeah. So businesses, investment in businesses, definitely.
Cash is king, but it's always been that way because, just to tie it back into my earlier comments about the fact they see the residential property market is such a good bet because it's a stakeholder society, and for some anachronistic reason, everyone's always flocked to it because they think it's, for a lot of people, it's the extent of what they understand in terms of investment. Historically, it does work.
Well, I mean, a lot of people, that's been a common analysis from a lot of commentators in New Zealand, that property investment, residential realty is somewhat unsophisticated. It's all people know. If only you understood the share market and understood all these other asset classes. But there was a big study in the United States, a very credible study, that showed that of all the different asset classes over the last, I think, 120 years, residential realty has been the best performing class. So there's whether it's highly informed and wise, or just all the people know, it has been a very good thing to do.
Yeah,
in terms of growing wealth, and probably will remain a good thing to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Bob Jones. I mean, you can think what you like about the guy, but he wrote one of those dreadful books. And, I say dreadful because it was Bob Jones, but there were some real gems in there. And he talked about the whole, I think I read it my first year at law school, the whole stakeholder society. While people always want to keep up with the Jones and live in the, nicest area they can and send little Johnny and Madeline to schools, because of that, those properties are always going to have blue chip status and then, corollary value. So it's not a bad bet if you can afford to get into it. All right, guys, I think we can, 45 minutes is enough of our mugs on these. Anybody else, before we wrap up, we'll give it like a minute or so, has any other questions, then we'll just politely go away.
Just politely excuse ourselves.
To maybe kill some airtime while that may or may not happen, Shane, that question about the question we got a little earlier about cancelling a lease if say you've bought a gym type business and you can't get access. It'd be worth noting on that recent case that came out, that recent judgment, that seemed to be supportive of the argument that it's about access to customers as much as access to premises. It would be, if you're in a situation like that, it would be very worthwhile trying it on with your landlord to get a rent abatement for levels 2 and potentially 1 as well as 3 and 4 when access resumes. If you've got an argument that your access to your customers is continuing to be affected even after your access to your premises has been restored, that is certainly a fight worth having.
Yep.
What was I remember? Sorry, Mark.
You go, mate. Yep.
Sorry, Mark. I remember we've talked about this before, but what was the example you used to sort of to illustrate access to customers via access to premises?
Well, I think the case in question was a coffee shop at the bottom of a large tower block building that housed IRD or an IRD, some part of IRD. And when the lockdown ended and we went back to level 2, I think, IRD made the decision that they were going to excessive caution.
From
home. So you had this business was able to commence trading, to return to the premises, but they're effectively their entire customer base,
a ghost town,
and so they refused to pay rent, and it all ended up in the court. And the court was actually very sympathetic to that argument, notwithstanding the contract, which is, I mean, once again going right back to what we were talking about at the beginning. This I think this was a High Court case, and maybe the High Court shouldn't have been sympathetic to that argument, given the contract very explicitly says access to premises. In light of this, this is a Supreme Court judgment that we were discussing.
Bathurst that we were talking about.
But for whatever reason, they were sympathetic, and I don't think that'll hold up over the long term.
No.
What it does mean is that there's a window right now. If you're a tenant and you don't have access to customers for whatever reason, coming out of lockdown, people just aren't returning to work around your business, or whatever else. It's a window where you've got a case you can point to. You can write a hard legal letter and refuse to pay your rent, and sort of negotiate something out that might be a bit better than paying the full rent. But I think over time that case will not hold up.
A couple of light-hearted questions to finish off this little endeavor. So, Space, is investing in basketball cards worthwhile? Wow.
Hand over to you, Shane.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes and no. So I've been doing it for about 15 months now. I did it as a kid. And, if you buy all the modern stuff and open packs, you're probably going to lose money. But I've got one tip for you, is that supply and demand. So scarcity is everything, and also Hall of Fame players. So Jordan, LeBron, Kobe Bryant, even Giannis Antetokounmpo, who's just won his first ring. And if you go onto eBay and look at all of the sort of middling, average, non-rookie Michael Jordan cards that were printed from 1990 to 1998 or 2000, a lot of those were $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 US until the whole boom happened in April of last year. So I've been buying up LeBron cards of a similar short print run. So either numbered like to 50 or 10 or whatever, that have got a kind of cool design that mimic these Jordan cards, because I believe that in 15 to 20 years, when all the kids who are 10, 11, 12, 15, 20, who don't yet have the disposable income, but look at LeBron the same way that people like us looked at Jordan in the late 80s, early 90s. I think that those cards, because they're so scarce, are actually an amazing investment, and it's great fun as well. It's got me through a few lockdowns, and I really enjoy investing in basketball cards. It does have its downside, but if you do your research, I think it's a really cool investment, and it's real, unlike cryptocurrency. You can actually hold them. And the last question I've been getting creative in the kitchen over the lockdown and perfecting my scrambled eggs with chili flakes, but my eggs don't seem to have enough volume or fluffiness. Can anyone help? Liam,
Liam's the man for
team
that.
get away in Pedo Bay. I think you need to. This is your chance to.
Light and fluffiness. Well, maybe you want to beat them, whisk them, get a bit more air in there. So give them a good whisk in the bowl, and just don't go hard on the heat. You want to go medium, sort of at most. Ease into your day. Don't go hard and fast with a 1 minute scramble. All right, just get yourself a coffee. Just sort of chop up the chives that you're inevitably going to be sprinkling on top, and just put on maybe 4 minutes, and then just figure 8 patterns in the pan, and just sort of work around, and then that's how you do it. That's the secret.
Liam, given your predilection towards chin stroking when it comes to drafting complex legal arrangements, I imagine you would give those eggs a real intense scrutiny, a lot of love.
Oh yeah, a lot of love. Unless I'm doing an omelet, you don't want too much air in there. You want a nice thick, so it's a little bit less vigorous on the whisking. That's my another gourmand tip.
Gourmand. And we've got one last comment. Shane, you mentioned you traded your Ethereum for a different token. How is that performing? That question came from someone who bought $14,000 worth of Luka Doncic rookie cards. And those rookie cards, like I said before, but with the basketball card investment schema, the key is limited supply. There are now 18,000 of those cards being printed. So say no more. And by the way, the token isn't doing that well, but that's okay. Guys, thanks for tuning in, and we hope we gave you a little bit of value here or there amongst our woeful banter and our ugly mugs. But it's great to have everybody on, and something to do for
fun.
More. I think I'm going to get out there and go for a walk.
Carpe that DM.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Awesome. Cheers.
Liam.
See you, mate.